Ignatius Loyola and his companions find their way to Rome. And in Rome, they begin to minister to the people, and most especially those who are on the margins of society. They suffer some reputational damage. Yet, despite this, Ignatius and his companions still press on to help souls for the greater glory of God. Ignatius goes to Pope Paul III. He has been confirmed at La Storta that this little band of missionaries, this little band who are preaching good news, should be called the Companions, or as we have it today in English, the Society of Jesus. And he explains to Pope Paul III all that he wants them to do. And Paul III is most intrigued with this and responds to Ignatius by saying, "The finger of God is here." And so on the 27th of September, 1540, he gives a formal approval to this new religious order in the Catholic Church called the Society of Jesus. Because he does this, they need to put more structure now into their life together. And the first thing they need to do is to elect someone who will be the head of this band, who will be the head of this Society of Jesus. And so Ignatius and his companions gather to vote for what will later be called the General of the Society of Jesus. On the first ballot, Ignatius is elected, and he is very unhappy about this. So Ignatius says to his companions, "Let's go our separate ways. Let's pray, let's discern, and let's come back and vote again." Well, they come back and they vote again. And yet again, unanimously, Ignatius, except for his own vote, is elected as the general. Still unhappy and unsure about this, Ignatius goes off to see his Franciscan confessor. And his confessor listens to him and his concerns, but says to Ignatius, "I suspect that this is the will of God, and so you should accept this election." Ignatius Loyola becomes the first general of this newly founded Society of Jesus. And this will change Ignatius's life in a way that he did not want. In fact, it will cause him quite a bit of suffering. Ignatius, who wants to be out ministering to people, most especially in spiritual conversation, by offering people the spiritual exercises, by visiting the sick, the poor, and the outcasts of Rome, will now be confined to 2 small little rooms as he becomes an administrator of this order. Ignatius will need to, in the course of the years ahead, write the constitutions for this religious order. And he will base those constitutions, which are really the way of life of these men who belong to the Society of Jesus, called Jesuits, on the spiritual exercises themselves. In fact, many of his companions say that the practical living out of the spiritual exercises will be found in the constitutions. But Ignatius has to learn something else. He now has to become a father to these men who are his companions. And we are told that he does this with a certain strictness and gentleness, that Ignatius will want to look after these missionaries who will go all over the world. From the 9 that Ignatius accompanied to Rome, he will see in his own lifetime the society grow to over 1,000 members, spread all over Europe, to Brazil, and to Japan. And so he dedicates himself to looking after these men who go out on mission. And Ignatius does this by writing letters. In fact, we have more than 7,000 letters that Ignatius wrote to Jesuits, to men and to women, consoling them and offering them spiritual advice. And Ignatius lives in Rome in a community with other Jesuits. And we are told that at times he was very patient, that he tried to listen to each individual member, that for him it was very important that no one's reputation was ever put at stake. And there are a number of stories that are told. Ignatius' strictness is seen when two of the brothers come home late and are late for dinner, and he refuses to allow them to eat and sends them to their rooms that night without any dinner. On the other hand, we're also told of a young man who enters this society and is doing what we call the novitiate, the first few years of his training. And one day he's working, cleaning out a room, and comes out of the room full of dust and cobwebs. And he gets an awful fright when, walking in the corridor, he sees Ignatius coming in the other direction. And he begins to immediately apologize profusely for the dust and the dirt. And Ignatius says to him, "Calm down. I prefer my followers to look like this than anything else." And so Ignatius learns slowly how to encourage, how to console, and how most of all to help this band of missionaries as they go about doing whatever it is that they are asked to do by the church. Ignatius, for him, the unity of minds and hearts is very important. And so by writing these letters, he tries to keep in contact with every single one of his companions, no matter where they go or what they are doing. Now we must remember, in those days, letters may have taken 3, 4, 5, 6 months to reach their recipients. And it would take another 3, 4, 5, 6 months for a letter to be returned. Ignatius' closest companion, Francis Xavier, who goes to Japan, receives a letter from Ignatius. And Xavier dies before he manages to reply to Ignatius. And Ignatius hears only much later that his first and closest companion, Xavier, has passed away. But there's something else important that Ignatius does during this time. Ignatius, we are told, becomes a great consoler for many people, not only his companions. That when people left his office after seeing him, they would come out smiling and feeling consoled. In the 4th week of the spiritual exercises, Ignatius wants us to encounter the Christ who consoles. And in his own life, he tries to live this consoling Christ, this resurrected Christ, by the way that he deals with other people. Many people, not just his own companions, but the poor and the sick and those who meet him on the streets, speak often of how he consoles them whenever he encounters them. Ignatius dies in Rome on the 31st of July, 1556. And when people hear that Ignatius has passed away in the bars and cafes of Rome, many echo the words, "The saint has died. The saint has died." Ignatius makes a remarkable journey from a reckless young man to someone who is sought out for his wisdom and also for spiritual counsel. And for many people, someone whose pattern of life is holy, someone who inspires them, someone that they too want to follow. Ignatius leaves behind the society of Jesus. But perhaps more important than the society of Jesus is his legacy of the spiritual exercises which he offers to the whole church. Those exercises are born of Ignatius's own experience, of his own journey, so to speak, from death, from his time before his conversion to resurrection, the founding of this religious order that will change the face of the church at that time. Ignatius uses these spiritual exercises to try and help others encounter Christ as he encounters Christ. These spiritual exercises are not a book that is to be read, but rather these spiritual exercises are given as a guide to someone who is accompanying someone else. In other words, a guide of a retreatant. The retreatant is not meant to look at the exercises themselves. And Ignatius wants those exercises to be done with someone else. Why? Because he wants those exercises to be adapted to each individual. And therefore, the exercises can never be done alone. The exercises lead us into an encounter with Jesus Christ, but that is done in our encounter with another human being. These spiritual exercises have been through 4,500 editions. In other words, for the last 4 centuries, almost one edition per month. The Protestant Reformation scholar Heinrich Böhmer says that these spiritual exercises have changed the trajectory of humanity like no other volume he knows. Dallas Willard too tells us that these exercises help people, when adapted well, to grow in Christ-likeness. Ignatius's own encounter with the Lord, documented really in these spiritual exercises, have led thousands, perhaps countless people to a living relationship with Jesus Christ. And today, still, we are being invited to enter into a living relationship with Jesus Christ when we too go about doing these spiritual exercises. Ignatius wants to give everything to God, all that he is and all that he possesses. And so too, when we do those spiritual exercises, we're invited on a journey from death perhaps to resurrection, where we too are consoled in giving all that we are to Christ, as Ignatius himself did. Perhaps the life of Ignatius can be summed up in the prayer that he offers at the end of the spiritual exercises, a prayer he invites us to pray as well, giving ourselves completely to the Lord as he strived to do all his life. And that simple little prayer goes like this. Take, Lord, and receive all my liberty, my memory, my understanding, and my entire will. You have given all to me. I'll now give it back to you, Lord. All of it is yours. Use it according to your will. Give me only your love and your grace, for that is enough for me. From this reckless, worldly, self-absorbed young man, that a little stirring within him changes his life, and at the end he becomes this holy, wise sage that people are seeking out for spiritual guidance. And for me, it's almost like his whole life is a movement from interior death to interior resurrection. And I just find that change so remarkable and so inspiring because of just how ordinary it all seems. It's just in his ordinary experience that this happens.
I think when we witness the journey that Ignatius makes in his spiritual life, what really speaks to me is how he grows in the ability to live in a discerning, very present way. He is very reactive in the beginning of his life. He's quite a kind of hot-headed, passionate kind of person. And although he doesn't lose that passionate intensity, he becomes quite able to discern the movement and action of God in his life.
I think what speaks to me most about Ignatius' spiritual journey is how God, in God's grace, meets us where we are in the reality of our lives, no matter how messy it is, and then takes us on the next step of the journey.
I think the Examen of consciousness or praying your day is a very helpful prayer, and I find it helpful because when you're in the practice of doing it regularly, you start to detect patterns. So I may see something today, but in 3 or 4 months' time, if I'm continue doing that Examen, I start to notice what we've been calling that thread of God in my life. And I think as well that the Examen over a period of time helps us to see those times or places in our lives where we do feel that we've got energy and life versus those times that seem to drain us of energy. And when I notice, for example, that if I'm always in the same circumstances and feeling energy or de-energized, the Lord is saying something to me about where I am and what I'm doing, and maybe even inviting me to a new place.
I find praying my day or the Examen of consciousness to be exceptionally helpful. It's the way that I can get back in touch with that sense of where God is drawing me in my life. And it allows me to fine-tune the discernment that is going on and to stay as true as possible to that.
I have found reflecting upon my day with God very, very helpful. I sometimes find it hard to do the whole Examen every day, but usually some aspect of the Examen, particularly giving thanks for a gift received during the day or a kind gesture that came my way, or something beautiful that happened.